Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to really dig deep into the events that led up to World War II.
Yeah.
Specifically, we're focusing on those pivotal years, like 35 to 39, those
Mm.
years right before the war broke out. And we've got some incredible source material here, excerpts from a historical text, right, that's going to give us a whole new perspective on how things really went down. We always hear about, the big battles, but what about everything that happened before? All those events that, kind of set the stage for that global conflict.
Right.
So we're going to unpack all that today,
hmm
from like the Spanish Civil War to Japan invading China. We're going to cover it all, so buckle up.
It's going to be a wild ride. And I think what's really fascinating about this period is that, like, it challenges our, I don't know, our perception of World War II as just this sudden explosion, right?
Yeah.
Like, bam, out of nowhere. But these sources, they paint a very different picture. It's more like a slow burn, right? This gradual escalation of, like, aggression and all these missteps by the so-called international community. It's a kind of cautionary tale. It's like a reminder that even small conflicts, they can easily spiral out of control.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so important to understand this period, right?
Absolutely.
Because it's like, okay, these things happened, but why? What were the warning signs? What could have been done differently? So let's rewind the clock. All the way back to 1935, Italy decides to invade Ethiopia. And, on the surface, it might just seem like, oh, another regional conflict. But this wasn't just any conflict. This was a major turning point, right?
Right. It exposed the weakness of the League of Nations.
Oh, absolutely. The League, it was formed after World War I, right?
Yeah.
With all these high hopes of preventing future wars, right?
Collective security, right. An attack on one is an attack on all.
Exactly. And when Italy invaded Ethiopia, well, the League was supposed to step in, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't. And it really showed the limitations of this whole idea of collective security.
Because on paper, it sounds great, right? But when push comes to shove, self-interest often wins out.
Right. Like nobody wanted to really risk getting involved in a bigger conflict.
Right. It was all about protecting their own interests.
Yeah.
And so they just kind of stood by. And this inaction, well, it sent a very dangerous message to the world.
Absolutely. It basically gave a green light to
Yeah.
other aggressive powers.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hitler, the military leaders in Japan, they were watching.
Right?
And they saw that, hey, the international community, they're not willing to act decisively.
Yeah.
And they were ready to exploit that weakness.
It's almost like the League of Nations was this big idea that just couldn't deliver when it mattered the most.
Mm-hmm.
And the consequences, well, we're going to see those unfold, right, as we move forward.
Oh, yeah. The ripple effects of this inaction, they were huge.
Huge. And speaking of ripple effects, just a year later, in 1936, the Spanish Civil War breaks out.
Mm.
And again, it might seem like, oh, another internal conflict.
Mm-hmm.
But this was far from just a Spanish affair, right?
Oh, this was a proxy war.
Yeah.
You had all these major powers getting involved, but kind of from the sidelines, right?
Right.
Germany and Italy, they were backing the nationalist rebels led by this guy Franco.
Right.
And they saw this as an opportunity, a chance to test out their new weapons, their new tactics. And on the other side, you had the Soviet Union supporting the Republican government.
And it's just like, it's chilling to think that this conflict, the Spanish Civil War, it was almost like a preview of the horrors that were to come in World War II.
Oh, absolutely. Like, this was the testing ground for all the horrors of modern warfare, aerial bombardment, tanks, just brutal tactics all around.
Yeah.
And beyond that, the Spanish Civil War really exposed the ideological divides that were ripping Europe apart.
Right. Fascism versus communism.
Exactly. It was setting the stage for the larger conflict that was brewing.
It's like the world was watching a dress rehearsal for World War II, but didn't fully grasp the implications, or maybe they just didn't want to see it.
Right. It's like everyone was so focused on avoiding another war that they missed the warning signs, or maybe they just chose to ignore them.
And while all this is happening in Europe, across the globe, in Asia,
Yeah.
Japan was making its own aggressive moves, right?
Hey, yeah. By 1937, Japan, they were driven by this idea that they were destined to rule Asia.
Right.
And they launched this full-scale invasion of China. And this was a major turning point.
It was. It destabilized the entire Asia-Pacific region, right? It's easy to get caught up in the European theater of World War II, but Japan's actions in China were just as significant.
Absolutely. And the consequences were devastating. Millions of people died, widespread destruction.
And the brutality, like the Nanking Massacre, it's just horrifying.
Yeah, the scars of that conflict are still felt today.
So it's like this parallel story unfolding. While Europe's teetering on the edge of war, Japan is committing atrocities and expanding its empire in Asia. The road to World War II, it wasn't just a European story.
Not at all. It was a global crisis. And these conflicts, they weren't happening in isolation. They were all interconnected, feeding off each other.
Right. And to make things even more complicated, Japan wasn't just fighting in China. They were also having these border clashes with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, these border clashes, they were more than just skirmishes.
Right.
It was this clash of ideologies. Japan's expansionism, it was a direct challenge to the Soviet Union's sphere of influence.
So you've got Italy invading Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War raging, and Japan waging war in China and clashing with the Soviet Union. The late 1930s, it sounds like the world was a complete mess, but what about Europe?
Well, in Europe, Hitler was getting bolder.
Right.
1938, he annexes Austria,
Like that.
violates the Treaty of Versailles, but no one really does anything about it.
Right. He was testing the waters, and he realized that appeasement was like the default mode for the major powers.
Yeah, Britain, France, they were so desperate to avoid another war.
Yeah.
They thought if they just gave Hitler what he wanted, he'd be satisfied, you know?
Right. Like, just appease him and everything will be fine.
Yeah, that was the thinking.
But we know that appeasement rarely works.
Right. It almost never does.
It just emboldens aggressors. And that's exactly what happened with Hitler. Just a few months after taking Austria, he sets his sights on Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland. And this is where we get the Munich Agreement, right?
Yeah, September 1938. Britain and France basically hand over the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for, well, what turned out to be empty promises of peace.
It's almost like they just gave away a piece of another country. And it's heartbreaking to think that they betrayed Czechoslovakia, thinking it would prevent a larger war.
The Munich Agreement, it's often seen as the ultimate failure of appeasement because it just emboldened Hitler even more.
Right. He was like, okay, they're not going to stop me.
Exactly. And he was right. Just a few months later, he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia, broke his promises, showed the world that he didn't care about diplomacy.
He just took what he wanted.
Yeah, it was clear that appeasement had failed. But by then, it was too late. Hitler was on a roll. He wanted more. And his next target, Poland.
And this is where things get really, really tense. Because Poland was where Britain and France finally decided to draw the line.
Yeah, 1939. They pledged to defend Poland if Germany attacks. No more appeasement.
It's like the stakes just went through the roof. You have Hitler, who's been getting away with everything, now facing off against Britain and France, who are finally ready to fight back.
Yeah, the world was holding its breath. It felt like anything could happen.
It's just crazy to think about, right? Europe's like right on the edge of war. Germany's ready to pounce on Poland.
Yeah.
And Britain and France are like, no, not this time. So what was it? What was the final straw? What actually pushed things over the edge and, started World War II?
Well, it's kind of wild, right? Just weeks before Germany invades Poland, Hitler, he goes and signs this non-aggression pact with Stalin.
Wait. With Stalin? The leader of the Soviet Union. It's like, sworn enemies suddenly becoming best buds. How did that even happen?
Right. I mean, it shocked everyone. This pact, they called it the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and it totally changed, the whole political landscape of Europe. It was a huge gamble for Hitler, but strategically it was brilliant,
But Hitler, he was all about destroying communism. So why would he make a deal with Stalin?
Well, for Hitler, it was all about strategy, right? He was obsessed with this idea of avoiding a two-front war, fighting on two sides at once. That was Germany's nightmare in World War I. So by making this pact with Stalin, he basically neutralized that threat on his eastern border.
Yeah.
He could focus all his energy on, conquering Poland and pushing west.
So it was all about eliminating potential enemies before making his big move. But wasn't there more to this pact? Weren't there some secret, shady deals going on behind the scenes?
Oh, yeah. There were these secret protocols attached to the pact. Basically, they divided up Eastern Europe. Germany gets this, the Soviets get that, carving up the map without even considering the people who live there.
Wow, that's cold.
Yeah.
It's like they just decided the fate of millions of people in a backroom deal.
Mm-hmm.
But what about Britain and France? They had promised to defend Poland. So how did they react to this whole pact thing?
Yeah, it put them in a really tough spot. I mean, they had pledged to support Poland, but now they were potentially facing, a war on two fronts, Germany in the west, the Soviet Union in the east. It was their worst nightmare.
It must have felt like the rug was just pulled out from under them, all their plans, all their diplomacy just gone. Did this pact basically mean game over for Poland, or was there still like a glimmer of hope that they could avoid war?
Even with, like the odds stacked against them, the diplomats, they kept trying right up until the last minute. It was like this flurry of messages, proposals, desperate pleas, but the momentum towards war, it was too strong.
That's almost like you're watching a movie, right? And you know what's going to happen, but you can't look away. It's like September 1st, 1939 is just looming, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it.
Right. And then, yeah, September 1st, 1939, Hitler unleashes the Blitzkrieg, fast, brutal, totally overwhelms the Polish defenses, and within weeks, it's over. Poland's defeated, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, just like they planned in that secret pact.
September 1st, 1939. It was like etched in history. The day the world went back to war. Years of like rising tensions, failed diplomacy, and just unchecked aggression, and it all explodes. And it just makes you wonder, could it have been prevented? Was there like a point where things could have gone differently, a different path?
Historians, they've been debating that for years. There were so many moments, right? So many points where things could have changed. The League of Nations not stepping up, appeasement backfiring, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that was huge. It all contributed.
It's easy to look back, right, and say, oh, they should have done this, or they should have known better. But it was a different world.
Yeah.
Right. Different fears, different priorities.
Right. You have to consider the context, right?
Yeah.
People were making decisions based on the information they had at the time, the pressures they were facing.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history, it's not just dates and battles. It's about people making choices, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but always within their own understanding of the world. But even though we can't change the past, we can learn from it, right?
Absolutely. By studying history, understanding how things unfolded, we gain insights into how conflicts start, the dangers of letting aggression fester, how fragile peace really is. Those lessons are just as important today as they were back then.
It's like that saying, right? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We have to learn from the mistakes, from the choices that led to such devastating consequences. We have to do better.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to engage with history, to understand it, not just memorize it.
Right, to really think about it. And as
Yeah.
we dig deeper into these sources, what really strikes me are the personal stories,
Yeah.
the human cost of war. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, but it's the individual stories that really hit home.
Yeah, absolutely. One story that really got to me was about this Polish woman, Irina Sendler. She was incredible. During the Nazi occupation, she risked her life to save thousands of Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. She smuggled them out, gave them new identities, found them safe places. She was so brave, so compassionate. It's inspiring.
It's just incredible, right? Even in the darkest times, you have these individuals who just shine, who remind us that there's always hope, always good in the world.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the road to war, it wasn't just paved with big decisions made by leaders. It was paved with the experiences of everyday people, their stories, their struggles, their courage. Those are all part of history, too.
It's those stories, those acts of courage that really give me hope. They remind us that even when everything seems lost, the human spirit can endure. There are always people who will stand up for what's right.
Exactly. And those stories are so important, especially when studying something as dark as war. They remind us that there's always hope, always the potential for good.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with this. As you keep exploring these sources, as you think about World War II, remember the people. Remember their stories. Remember the human cost of war.
And remember that history, it's not just about the past. It's alive. It shapes who we are, and it can guide us as we move forward. The lessons we learn from history, they can help us build a better world.
Yeah, it's amazing how those stories can really make history come alive and remind us that these events, they weren't just words on a page.
Yeah.
They were real experiences that shaped millions of lives.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the road to World War II, I'm really struck by just how complex it all was.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a tangled web of, political maneuvering and clashing ideologies and economic pressures. And in the end, it was a failure of diplomacy. Peace is fragile,
Yeah.
It has to be protected, nurtured.
And I think that's like one of the biggest takeaways from all of this, right? It's not just about knowing what happened, but why it happened.
Right.
What are the lessons we can learn from this period, to help us navigate the world today?
Well, one of the biggest lessons, I think, is that we can't ignore aggression,
Right.
especially when it starts small. Like we saw
Right.
that with Italy and Ethiopia, Japan and China, Hitler and Europe. Each time someone acted aggressively and got away with it, it emboldened them.
Right. It's like they were testing the limits
Yeah.
and no one stopped them.
Exactly. And appeasement, well-intentioned as it might have been, it just didn't work.
Yeah.
It just delayed the inevitable and probably made the conflict even worse when it finally did happen.
Right. Because it gave Hitler this false sense of confidence, like he could get away with anything.
Exactly.
And another thing that really stands out is the need for like strong international institutions.
Yes.
The League of Nations, it couldn't handle the rising tide of aggression, right?
Right.
It shows us how important it is to have, global cooperation to prevent these kinds of conflicts from happening in the first place.
Yeah, we're all interconnected now,
Right.
What happens in one part of the world affects us all.
Absolutely. And something else that really struck me is the role of information,
Oh, yeah.
like propaganda, misinformation. It was used to manipulate people,
Absolutely.
to justify aggression. And in today's world, with the internet and social media, it's more important than ever to be critical thinkers, to really question the information we're getting, to be media literate, to look for different perspectives.
Exactly. We have to be able to separate fact from fiction, recognize propaganda when we see it.
And that's where history comes in, right?
Right.
By understanding the past, by seeing how these things have played out before, we can develop those critical thinking skills
Absolutely.
and apply them to the world today.
Right.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
We've talked about, the mistakes, the missed opportunities, the things that went wrong.
Right.
But what about the moments of courage,
Yeah.
the acts of resistance, the people who stood up to tyranny? What can we learn from them?
That's a great question.
How can their stories inspire us to build a better world, a more peaceful world?
It's something to think about. History isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make now. It's about the future we want to create.
Yeah. And by learning from, the mistakes and the triumphs of those who came before us, maybe, just maybe, we can prevent those horrors from happening again. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been quite a journey, but we hope you've learned something, gained a new perspective.
Yes.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire you to learn more, to keep exploring, to keep thinking critically about the world around us. Until next time, keep those minds sharp.